There's an app sitting on more American phones right now than almost anything else on the market, and most of the people who downloaded it have no idea what's actually happening behind that cheerful orange logo. $5 wireless earbuds, $8 sneakers, a laptop for under $200. It sounds like the deal of the century. It isn't. It's a business model built on hidden losses, buried ownership, forced labor allegations, and a level of Chinese state entanglement that should make anyone pause before they hit checkout. We're talking about TEMU. If you've spent more than 10 minutes online in the last few years, you've seen it. It exploded onto the scene with a 9-figure Super Bowl ad blitz, then flooded every corner of the internet. YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, through paid influencers and an army of regular users chasing free stuff for referrals. Within months, it became one of the most downloaded shopping apps in the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and much of Europe. It didn't just compete with Amazon and Walmart. It became the thing people love to mock and can't stop buying from at the same time. But here's the question nobody asks before they type in their card number. Who actually owns this thing? And why does it work so hard to hide it? TEMU operates under a parent company called PDD Holdings. For years, that connection was right there on TEMU's own website. The company used to openly boast about leaning on its parent's vast network of merchants, logistics, partners, and established ecosystem. And it even cited PDD's multi-billion-dollar annual revenue as proof of its scale. Then, quietly, all of that language disappeared. Because PDD Holdings also owns Pinduoduo, a nearly identical shopping platform built for the domestic Chinese market and still headquartered in Shanghai. TEMU and Pinduoduo share the same corporate parent, the same playbook, and, as we'll get into, some deeply uncomfortable family resemblances. PDD itself has shuffled its official registered address around, at one point moving its address on file with U.S. securities regulators away from mainland China entirely, a move that critics say looks less like a business decision and more like an attempt to put distance between the brand and its Chinese roots at a moment when American trust in anything Chinese-owned is at a low point. And that distrust isn't irrational. Polling consistently shows a majority of Americans view China unfavorably, and similar sentiment shows up across much of Europe and the English-speaking world. So if you're a Chinese company trying to crack the American market, of course you'd want to look as American as possible. The problem is, no matter how many times TEMU insists it's a Boston company, the way it actually operates tells a very different story. Its fulfillment centers are based in Guangzhou. The overwhelming majority of its sellers are Chinese manufacturers. Chinese state media itself has referred to TEMU as an overseas arm of a Chinese company. TEMU markets itself as running a consumer-to-manufacturer model, where factories supposedly sell straight to shoppers with TEMU, just facilitating the transaction. A framing that conveniently lets TEMU wash its hands of responsibility whenever something goes wrong, whether that's a counterfeit product or a seller getting cheated, because sellers do get cheated. Reporting from international outlets that spoke directly with TEMU vendors described a pattern. Manufacturers ship inventory to TEMU's warehouses at their own expense, and TEMU can simply reject the goods if it doesn't like them. Worse, multiple sellers describe TEMU effectively dictating prices, asking sellers to cut costs, and if a seller refuses, their listings get pulled entirely. Several described selling at a loss just to stay on the platform, with one seller saying she eventually walked away rather than keep working essentially for free. That's not a rumor. That's a pattern lifted straight from Pinduoduo's own history, and it should worry anyone paying attention. Back in 2021, Pinduoduo made international headlines after a young employee in her early 20s collapsed and died walking home from work in the middle of the night. Less than 2 weeks later, another Pinduoduo employee took their own life after requesting time off. When a staffer using the name Wang Taishu spoke out publicly, posting an image of a coworker being loaded into an ambulance after collapsing. That employee says he was fired for it. Reports at the time alleged some workers were being pushed as high as 380 hours a month. For context, a standard 9-to-5 job runs roughly 160 hours a month. That's not overtime. That's a system running people into the ground. This is the corporate DNA sitting underneath TEMU's cheerful pricing. And it matters, because that same disregard for the humans in the supply chain is a big part of how TEMU manages to sell things at prices that shouldn't logically exist. Let's talk about the money, because the math on Temu doesn't add up the way a normal retailer's math adds up. Multiple financial analyses have estimated that Temu loses somewhere in the range of dozens of dollars on every single US order it fulfills. Not occasionally, but as a baseline cost of doing business. Multiply that across the volume of orders Temu processes, and you're looking at losses that have been estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. That's not a struggling startup burning through a seed round. That's a company backed by a parent that has posted billions in annual profit, deliberately eating losses to buy market share and starve out the competition. It's a strategy. Flood the market, undercut everyone, make it financially irrational for smaller competitors to survive, and worry about profitability later, once the competition is already dead. For years, one of the biggest tools that made this strategy possible was a quirk in US trade law known as the de minimis exemption, a rule that let any package valued under $800 enter the country completely duty-free and largely uninspected. Congress had multiple chances to close that loophole and repeatedly left it standing. And for a long time, it was basically a subsidy handed straight to companies like Temu and Shein. Billions of low-value packages poured into the US every year under that exemption, over $1 billion in a single year at its peak, dodging import duties and skipping the kind of customs scrutiny that normal retailers can't avoid. That changed. In 2025, the federal government moved to shut the loophole down entirely, first targeting shipments from China and Hong Kong specifically, then expanding the crackdown to close de minimis globally. The stated justification was national security. Concerns that the exemption had become a pipeline not just for cut-rate consumer goods, but for counterfeit products and even illicit drugs slipping through under-inspected low-value shipments. For Temu, the impact was immediate and visible. The company had to raise prices, pull back its aggressive advertising spending, and restructure how it sources and ships products to American customers, shifting more toward US-based warehousing instead of shipping every item directly from Chinese factories. The bargain bin pricing that built Temu's entire American identity took a real hit almost overnight. But don't mistake a closed loophole for a fixed business model. The underlying practices that got Temu here in the first place, the labor conditions, the ownership obfuscation, the lack of accountability for what its sellers do, didn't go anywhere. They just got a little more expensive to run. And speaking of accountability, let's talk about what happens when things go wrong for the actual customer, because it turns out go wrong is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Complaints against Temu have piled up fast with consumer protection organizations, and reviewers have consistently rated the company in mediocre to poor territory across major review platforms. One consumer watchdog official went on record saying it was unusual for such a young company to rack up that volume of complaints in such a short window. And that was back when the total sat in the dozens. Within less than a year of operating in the US, that number had ballooned into the hundreds. The recurring themes are almost always the same. Packages that never show up or arrive absurdly late. Customer service that's either unresponsive or openly hostile. Refunds that take forever to process if they process at all. Wrong items showing up in the box. And products that fall apart or malfunction almost immediately. One frustrated customer described being told their order qualified for a free return within a 90-day window, only to have the return portal lock them out on the final day of that window, and then get scolded by a support rep for waiting too long to request it. Temu has technically responded to the overwhelming majority of complaints filed against it. Actually resolving them is a different story. A large share are marked closed without any indication the underlying issue was fixed. Now, to be fair, plenty of people have had perfectly fine experiences on Temu. Some genuinely love it. But look closer at who's doing the loudest recommending, and a pattern emerges. A huge share of Temu's most enthusiastic promoters are getting products for free through the platform's referral system. The mechanic is simple. You share a personal referral link, a friend downloads the app and enters their information, and suddenly the price of whatever you're eyeing drops towards zero. The friend doesn't even need to buy anything for you to benefit. They just need to hand over their data. It's a growth hack dressed up as generosity, and it's remarkably effective at generating an army of unpaid brand ambassadors who genuinely believe they're doing you a favor. That data for discounts exchange brings us to a much bigger and much more uncomfortable question. What exactly is happening to all the information Temu is collecting, and where does it end up? This isn't paranoia. There's a well-documented pattern of Chinese link taps being used as data collection tools that serve interests well beyond ordinary advertising. In litigation involving ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, a former employee alleged the company had gathered intelligence on Hong Kong democracy activists and their personal networks years before Beijing's 2020 crackdown on the territory. China's legal system requires domestic companies to hand over data to the state on demand, with essentially no independent judicial check on that process the way there would be in the US or Europe. If a Chinese company gets an order from the government, refusing isn't really an option. Non-compliance risks the business itself getting shut down. Given that legal reality, the concerns around Temu's data practices aren't hypothetical. Temu's sister platform, Pinduoduo, was pulled from the Google Play Store after security researchers discovered it contained malware capable of secretly spying on users and, according to reporting that cited sources familiar with the matter, exploiting device vulnerabilities to gain elevated access without users' knowledge. The team responsible for that code reportedly wasn't fired. Sources said members of it were quietly reassigned to work on Temu instead. Cybersecurity researchers who examined the malicious code afterward warned that even though the active exploit had been removed, the underlying framework remained embedded and could theoretically be reactivated later. There's no confirmed public evidence that Temu itself has deployed anything like that. But the company has landed on multiple state-level government device ban lists over data security concerns and a coalition of state attorneys general, more than 20 of them, formally demanded answers from PDD Holdings leadership about consumer data handling, alleged Chinese Communist Party ties, and forced labor concerns, giving the company a hard deadline to respond. Around the same time, members of Congress separately pushed federal regulators to dig further into how Temu handles the personal and financial data of millions of American users. On top of that, plenty of ordinary customers have separately reported fraudulent charges showing up on their accounts and cards shortly after ordering from Temu, the kind of pattern that could be simple negligence or could be something worse. Given what happened with Pinduoduo, it's not unreasonable to want a real answer instead of a shrug. And then there's the darkest thread running through this whole story: forced labor. A congressional investigation examined Temu's supply chain directly and delivered a scathing verdict, finding that Temu essentially has no meaningful system in place to verify that the products flowing through its platform aren't tied to forced labor out of Xinjiang, the region where credible, extensive documentation shows the Chinese government has detained and coerced labor from Uyghur Muslims on massive scale. Investigators found that Temu doesn't audit its suppliers for this and largely just trusts sellers to self-report compliance, a system that functions, in practice, as no system at all. The same investigation found that Temu and Shein together were likely responsible for a staggering share of all low-value packages entering the United States every single day, exploiting the very de minimis loophole we just talked about to skip the kind of customs inspection that might have caught these issues sooner. Following that congressional report, federal investigators reportedly opened a formal inquiry into whether Temu is violating the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act outright, a law specifically designed to keep goods tied to Xinjiang forced labor out of American homes. If a company is formally found in violation, it can be added to an enforcement list that blocks its goods from entering the country altogether. That's how serious the exposure is here. This isn't activist rhetoric. It's a bipartisan congressional committee and federal Homeland Security investigators looking at the same evidence and reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. On top of forced labor, there's the intellectual property problem. Temu's own terms of service place the burden entirely on individual sellers to make sure they actually have the rights to whatever they're listing, which, in practice, means Temu takes essentially zero proactive responsibility for the flood of counterfeit and stolen designs that show up on the platform. If your work gets ripped off and sold on Temu, the burden falls entirely on you to prove it. And if Temu decides your claim doesn't hold up, you can be held liable for damages just for filing it. Even when a claim succeeds, an accused seller can push back with a counterclaim. And unless the original creator escalates to an actual court order within a tight window, the stolen listing can go right back up. It's a system that looks like it exists to satisfy the letter of the law while doing the bare minimum to actually protect anyone. There's also the question of what's actually inside these products and whether anyone checked before they landed on your doorstep. Because Temu benefited from that same low-scrutiny pipeline that its closest competitor, Shein, has been repeatedly caught exploiting. Canadian investigators once tested a children's jacket sold by Shein and found lead levels dozens of times higher than what's legally allowed in kids' products. Independent safety experts have flagged similar red flags across other Chinese fast fashion and low-cost goods brands for years. Banned dyes, unsafe chemical treatments, choking hazards that would never pass inspection in a normal retail supply chain. That's the trade-off baked into skipping customs scrutiny. Fewer inspectors means fewer chances to catch a problem before it reaches a kid's bedroom. TEMU and Shein aren't identical companies, but they share the same underlying playbook. Factories racing each other to the bottom on price, minimal oversight, and a shipping model explicitly engineered to slip under the radar of the agencies whose entire job is to catch this stuff. It's worth stepping back and asking why any of this was ever allowed to get this big in the first place. Part of the answer is that TEMU didn't invent this playbook. It perfected the timing. It launched right as American shoppers were feeling the squeeze of inflation, when dirt cheap was exactly the pitch millions of people were primed to say yes to. It launched with a marketing budget large enough to buy Super Bowl airtime in its first year in the country, an extraordinary spend for a company most Americans had never heard of a few months earlier. And it launched by recruiting an army of ordinary users and creators to do its advertising for it, dangling free products in exchange for referral links, so the growth would look organic even when it was engineered. That's a smart business strategy. It's also exactly the kind of strategy that works best when regulators are slow, when consumers are distracted, and when the actual ownership structure behind the friendly app icon stays just blurry enough that nobody stops to ask the obvious question. Whose interests does this company actually serve when push comes to shove? Given everything above, the corporate address shuffling, the scrubbed About Us language, the shared DNA with Pinduoduo, the legal obligation every Chinese company has to hand data to the state on request. That's not a question with a comforting answer. None of this is really about being anti-shopping or telling people to boycott a specific app. It's about understanding what you're actually opting into when you tap Install. A lot of people assume the worst-case scenario with an app like this is getting a slightly flimsy product or waiting an extra week for shipping. The reality is a lot bigger than that. It's a company under active federal investigation for forced labor. It's a company whose closest corporate sibling got caught building spyware into an app used by tens of millions of people. It's a company that built its entire competitive advantage around a customs loophole regulator specifically closed because it was being used to smuggle in everything from counterfeit goods to synthetic opioids. Those aren't small footnotes. Those are the actual foundation the business was built on. Add it all up and you get a fuller picture of what's really behind that friendly orange app icon. A company that spent years obscuring its ownership structure while operating out of Chinese warehouses that has been credibly linked through its own sister platform to a labor culture blamed for employee deaths, that built its entire pricing strategy around a trade loophole regulators only recently managed to close, that racked up hundreds of unresolved consumer complaints in record time, that sits under formal federal investigation for forced labor violations, and whose closest corporate relative got caught embedding spyware in an app used by millions. None of that means every single item that ships from TEMU is tainted, and none of it means everyone who's ever used the app is doing something wrong. But it's cheap has never been a complete answer to, is it worth it? Somewhere along that $8 supply chain, someone is almost always absorbing the real cost. An underpaid factory worker, a bullied seller forced to sell at a loss, a forced laborer with no ability to say no, or a customer quietly handing over more personal data than they ever agreed to. Cheap doesn't mean free. It just means somebody else is paying the difference. And TEMU has built an entire empire out of making sure it's never them. So the real question isn't whether TEMU can keep selling $5 sneakers. It's whether shoppers are willing to keep looking away from where those $5 actually come from. Every marketplace has a story it wants you to believe about itself. And every marketplace has the story that's actually true underneath. With TEMU, those two stories have never lined up. Not on where the company is based, not on how it prices its goods, not on how it treats the people making them, and not on what it does with the data of the people buying them. A closed loophole and a round of price hikes doesn't erase that gap. It just means the company is now doing the same thing at a slightly higher price point, while the underlying questions about labor, ownership, and data still sit there completely unanswered. That's the part worth remembering. The next time that orange icon shows up in an ad, dangling another spin the wheel discount or another, your card is about to expire notification. The price on the screen was never the whole price. It just took this long for enough of the real one to surface.